Good evening everyone and welcome to another 2MK How to Improve segment. Today we'll be looking at how to get some improvement by fighting the CPU when you have enough understanding of matchups or character to recognize what the CPU does that you can learn from to apply to players and what should not be applied. This content is being rebroadcast from my own personal Rillian2_MK channel to the main team's channel 2_MK with my full permission. So let's discuss Combo Breaker a little bit again. If you haven't been to a tournament, for most of them lately, you'll know who your opponents are, probably, assuming no disqualifications, nearer to the time that you actually enter. A couple days before you get to see who is in your pool, and with Smash GG and Challenge brackets, you can actually see who you'll be facing and in what order. So, this year I got Banana Jin, a fairly high level Ibuki, and Commander Jesse, probably the at least 4th Dhalsim in the world, if not the 2nd or 1st. I mean, no disrespect to any high level Dhalsim out there. Y'all can fight over who's the best on your time. On my time, I have to fight the person in question. Now, since I had to beat Banana Jin to get to Commander Jesse, there wasn't a whole lot of time to make that decision about whether or not to prepare. But you always should prepare for relatively good case scenarios, especially since loser's bracket is a bit more confusing. You can't be as sure who you'll end up facing, especially if not everyone actually ends up showing up. Whereas top players have a strong tendency to show up for their pools and so on. If you expect to be facing any of them, that is going to be a thing that probably doesn't change. My problem, of course, being I have no Dhalsim experience. I mean, I know what our kata and bot are for, but those are for beginners. Those are not for high level play. Dhalsim plays a certain way at certain levels of the game, and there are certain things you have to learn to deal with firsthand before you can learn how to defeat someone using top level strategy. So, having recognized that, okay, I don't have any Dhalsim fighting plan with Chun-Li at all, my first thing became trying to learn to deal with basic buttons I should be hitting and situations I should be looking out for. Things that a CPU does may never come up in a real match, but you'd feel pretty stupid if you ignored all of them and said, well, this will never happen, and it turns out that somehow the CPU does play a lot like a person. Then you've just wasted preparation. So if you're only thinking about how you can improve your comfort in the matchup and perception of certain things, being able to view them, being able to understand hitboxes and hurtboxes of strange interactions and so on, and not high-level strategy or reactions, you can actually get a lot out of CPU fighting. Many of us suffered that. I don't know what that was. I don't know what was just happening. And this can happen to a lot of people. It doesn't necessarily mean, oh, this won't happen to top level players, people that would enter tournaments. Lots of people enter tournaments. And if you don't have high level partners to train particular things, it really doesn't matter. Because where else are you going to get an advantage on it? You can watch theoretically how it should be done. But I've watched Commander Jesse fight often enough to know how that would be done. And still can say that I don't actually understand some of what is going on in the matchup relative to my own character. Because it's one thing to say I've seen Commander Jesse fight, and another thing to realize I've probably never seen Commander Jesse fight Chun-Li. So, the first thing I ended up doing was trying to figure out how this matchup works and what I'm supposed to do in it for basic things. Especially from the perspective of minimizing damage rather than avoiding taking it. This is another important thing when it comes to facing high-level players. You can't really avoid taking any damage against them. They're probably a bit beyond you for that. They almost always damage each other. So you can be pretty sure that you're not going to get away unscathed either. But what you want is to minimize the amount of damage you take so that you don't get too flustered in matches, or fail certain executions, or have weird reactions at spaces where you could have had better ones. Understanding when trades happen, when scrambles tend to come up, as little advantage as you can get that they can do very little about, or would have to do risky things in order to benefit from. All of these things are important. Now, once Combo Breaker came around, two things happened. The first is that yes, I did lose to Bananagen, so that really didn't matter. I didn't need to do any preparation for Commander Jesse because I didn't fight him. The second thing that happened was interesting because there were at least two other Chun-Li in my pool, one of which eliminated me actually. I don't have a lot of mirror match experience either, but I think they would have won anyway. But the interesting and important thing was that I got to watch this person fight Commander Jesse because that was who sent them to losers. At least I'm pretty sure that was how that went. And they didn't change character either. So while I did not fight Commander Jesse, it turned out that another Chun-Li did. And I was able to watch that whole match, and I was able to ask Commander Jesse afterward about it. Now, obviously, I didn't get to test the strategy I had developed. We were in pools, he was busy. I asked for a moment of his time, and he was kind enough to explain to me in quite a lot of detail. I hope it wasn't too confusing because I had actually asked him what Dhalsim does in the situation, and he gave me sort of a Dhalsim-centric explanation, like as if I were a Dhalsim player. So if you ever see this, sorry if I misled in any way and made you think I was trying to figure out how to solve the problem from the Dhalsim side. But no, I asked him, what would you do if the approach the Chun-Li player took was to just do this? Because I had realized in my training that actually Chun-Li is really good at getting away from Dhalsim. I'm not sure if this is true for other players, for other characters, but because she can go off the wall at particular spaces, has good long normals to punish when weird things happen, and has some fairly evasively strange hitboxes. And hurtboxes, obviously. I eventually realized, why am I going toward you? When I go toward you, I die. When I jump away from you, I get out of a lot of things. But obviously I figured this can't possibly work. This is way too simplistic to not have a really easy Jalsin-based counter. Obviously, teleporting would seem to be it, but the CPU does that. And you can figure out how to trick it into doing that more often. The point is that once you have decided, I'm going to practice something from the CPU, you do still have to test it against a person, probably. But that doesn't mean it's useless. Because you can learn nuances of it that happen primarily because it's a CPU match. They're consistent in the way that AI is applied in this game for a lot of the CPU stuff. And there's a lot of little things you can learn just range-based if you have a less conventional strategy to test. I also did test this against at least 2 Dhalsim, but since I do keep this general level in order to get more data, those would not have been the tournament level. Still, silver and up is not usually a place where people have a lot of strategic failings. They have issues with things like recognizing things, reacting, stuff that requires practice more so most of the time than thinking through things. It depends on your character, but most of us have a decent idea of how to play our character once we are able to stay solidly in the silver rank. And the influx of new players hasn't actually changed this, despite the fact that a lot more of our time has been spent getting ranked up, and there are more players at the bottom of the pyramid to push everyone else up. All that's still true. But because it tends to be tiers of skill, rather than just, oh, this person has a couple more wins than me, you'll find that a lot of silver players would get bumped up to gold and stay there. A lot of bronze players would get bumped up to silver and stay there. So you have to understand what you're getting out of it. After playing those matches, I quickly realized the flaw in the tactic was not so much at the time, the tactic itself, but my execution of it and certain instincts I have relative to the game. Dhalsim makes a lot of those instincts useless and requires not only having new reactions, but having those reactions very fast. It's one thing to teach yourself a new 7-frame punish. It's another thing to teach yourself a mid-screen with punish off a scramble. Characters with a lot of mobility and evasive hitboxes can pick up a lot from CPU fighting. Once again, especially if you aim at making sure that you're aiming to avoid damage rather than to entirely avoid it. You're aiming to reduce the damage you're taking. Sorry. Now, since a lot of this game is just about conditioned reactions, that was where I was saying we should start. There's a lot of stuff in the Dhalsim matchup, at least fortunately, that you will have a lot of trouble doing if you've built up a lot of muscle memory based on other characters. Because Dhalsim doesn't move like other characters. And you can try this yourself, but I don't think it really works on characters other than Chun-Li and Vega, and to some extent Juri. If you happen to play any of those, or are interested in just trying it out to see what happens, you can see what happens yourself. I can tell you that at the beginning of this interaction, even the CPU could be discouraging. Not because, oh, I can't beat the CPU. Although honestly, Dhalsim gets pretty close to that for me. I'll totally admit that. I beat CPU Dhalsim the same way we mostly beat characters in the arcade. Count on the fact that the CPU doesn't defend well, abuse our outputs, and so on. But Dhalsim's good at actually getting around a lot of this. The things that most of us use at the lower levels to get damage on the CPU, Dhalsim is not particularly susceptible to. It's similar to how, with a little input reading, Rashid becomes a nightmare. If you're not like constantly jumping at him. So that was the first thing to learn. This is actually difficult enough to do. You can't just get upset and beat him up based on taking off more health. And of course, given that this is kata style training, as we always do, the CPU is given regenerating health so that you can completely remove your focus on whether or not you're doing enough damage and devote it to, am I doing the right thing? And if you've played against the CPU in arcade mode, even on hard, it's not actually that hard. And as soon as you can take off health, you only have to be a certain amount of lucky. I've tested both those things just this morning, in fact. Finally bothering to poke at the arcade mode, finding it functionally trivial. Normal mode is trivial, hard mode is a little less than trivial, but you could do it with some luck. If you weren't trying to get points and just trying to win, you could easily do that. Even the extra battle triggered Necalli that is currently up has a pattern that you can decode and leaves itself open in ways that you could do decently high damage to it. So when you hear people tell you, oh, that was easy, I did it in like 5 tries or like 2 tries or first try. First try is usually either luck or character stuff. Unless the person is extremely good. This is because, once again, you're facing something that doesn't actually look like normal or act like normal. If you have 1,000 fight money to spare and want to see what I'm talking about, go fight Triggered Necalli. It's not really, this is super hard. It is, you don't do any Necalli things. You have way more damage, you have way more this or that or whatever. The CPU, however, doesn't have these particular bonuses. Therefore, it's easier to get away with a lot. And even the same Triggered Necalli has a set amount of health. After a while, all you have to do is be a little luckier with what you've figured out in his pattern, and you'll get something. So, I have already gotten enough experience with this to look decently competent at it. But that is because of a bunch of reactions and spacings I have built up, which may not apply at all to real matches. as noted. But based on what I saw of the match between Commander Jessie and the other Chun-Li player, a lot of it would have come up, even if only in the sense that knowing what not to do because Commander Jessie's control of Dhalsim is much better would have helped. Because the other thing the CPU is good at is helping you see when a small difference in situation has changed the response you should have. But you'll notice a lot here that for Chun-Li at least, while getting caught in blocking Dhalsim's limbs is a terrible thing, back jumping out of them is usually not. She can evade a lot of things this way. In fact, if you're really determined, you can do a bunch of neutral jump stuff if you have the timing down and you think your opponent will keep on throwing out buttons. This is another good part of it. That one, however, I figured, you can't do that on reaction, and Commander Jessie would read that and quickly adapt to that. Whereas, my experience so far indicated that jumping away from Dhalsim altogether has a lot more variability because Chun-Li does not have to go off of the wall at the same time every time. Therefore, not only would it take longer to adapt, it's not even that style of scrubbing it out and doing something unexpected. It might more so be that one can't react to it consistently in the first place. But let's look at some other stuff that I can be learning from the CPU and am learning from the CPU right now. That's very important. There are 4 reactions that I am still trying to build up. The first is when Dhalsim goes for the quick teleport cross-up, Chun-Li can beat this with just crouch light punch, that is. You have to measure whether or not he is in the air in the correct spacing, because if he's too high up, you'll obviously whiff and get beaten up. So you have to react to how high he was when he disappeared, and then do this. The fortunate thing about this sort of response is, while it does nearly no damage, he can't avoid it, first of all. And secondly, you don't actually care whether or not he went behind you or not. It's a quick enough move that if he did just teleport in place, he can't harm you for having done it. So it's an overall good reaction to have. Now if you spend too much time watching out for that, you won't be able to react to getting out of the way of Yoga Flame or him walking forward into buttons and those sorts of things. So you still have to be ready to jump away from him as well. And you have to realize when that's not a good idea to do either, because he's prepared for that. Fortunately, the CPU is really good at that sort of interaction. Teaching you what you can't do because you don't have time to do it. The CPU actually responds at all, it will almost always do so in time, because CPU not only reads inputs but has perfect timing. You can also use it to learn standard spaces you end up at, when certain moves are punishable or not, based on spacing differences, things that bots are slightly less useful for teaching, in fact. time I've been building up this effectively automatic response to this matchup. I don't have experience in Dhalsim matchup at any mid or higher level at all, and this is not giving me that. What it is giving me is a feeling of comfort when I see Dhalsim move, and some muscle memory based on those movements. As well as some minor things and basic strategy that flow in there as well. One good example is the fact that throwing Chun-Li's heavy punch Kikoken or her light punch Kikoken are both technically incorrect in this matchup. And you can learn that without having to decipher whether or not it's true for every player of the character. The CPU has enough variance in how it moves that you can just recognize over time. I need to use the medium punch one because you will be this far away, but the light punch one actually ends up being slightly too slow. At the speed of CPU reading inputs, it can get out of certain things. You don't recover fast enough or whatever. So, since I tend to not do medium punch Kikoken, it's either not necessary in matchups where I should have learned it before now, or just not a thing that you normally do because it doesn't have most of the benefits that you would expect or wish for. Until further notice, I have to learn to do this purely for Dhalsim. Part of the benefit of talking to higher level players, in my case among the highest, is that they can help you understand what the CPU is definitely not doing that they would do. And this is another way to use this to learn from the CPU rather than discarding it because, well, it's not that player. Commander Jesse pointed out that it's not really that hard to trip Chun-Li when she's landing. For example, at that space, if you realize they're definitely going to jump, you have enough time to hit his heavy punch, which that one, and just catch her legs as she lands. At that point, it's become a trip guard question. But either way, the Chun-Li player isn't gaining any advantage if you keep on doing that to them. From there, we get the evolution of, well, what Chun-Li buttons can help keep her in the air a little longer to make that harder to time? Or is there even a chance of that? Is there a way to possibly attack a Dhalsim who is attempting to have that reaction, as I've just tried to do and somewhat shown? Because part of what I learned while going through this was that Chun-Li has so much capacity to change her hitboxes by doing moves, hurtboxes by doing moves, that it's difficult for Dhalsim to be confident that he can hit her if he has the same reaction with the same timing every time. It's absolutely not that there's a space or a way for Chun-Li to make sure Dhalsim can't hit her. He always has the option. He has lots of them. His bat heavy punch, for example, will cover almost every reaction you could have there. But the CPU doesn't use that. And if you're familiar with Dhalsim, you know from the beginning that something's off because it doesn't use that on you. It's absolutely assured that a player who spends a lot of time with this character would just hit Yoga Anvil there. So it's not as if this literally off-the-wall solution that you do it against the CPU, realize it works, and then decide it's a good idea. You need more than that. You need to find some person to test the main things on. But you are still benefiting at least a little bit from the interactions with the CPU because it shows you what is possible for the character and to some extent for the person. It also increases familiarity I mentioned before. And if you're daring enough to try a lot of things, can give you a ton of knowledge that you would have to otherwise grind out very slowly in matches. The combination of these things, therefore, is useful enough to make fighting the CPU not a total waste of your time for a matchup, even if the CPU isn't that strong or that good at doing the things that you see the matchup normally involve. This probably isn't even true for all CPU characters, but it works for quite a few of them, which is how we end up developing katas. We also have specialized ones, basically such as this one, for when the situation is not as expected. Let's look at, for example, the other thing that he told me. If you're in the air already, Chun-Li can't really reach you because Dhalsim's jumping medium punch will attack laterally and can be cancelled into his V-skill. This is, I believe, a recent buff. This means that rather than trying to stay on the ground and anti-air Chun-Li, Dhalsim would have the option to go into the air every time, clip her, and stay there. And once you have that, this is what I was told, once you have that, Chun-Li has very few options, because once he does float, especially high up, you can't really do much about it other than hit like heavy kick or something. I haven't tested and I didn't ask him whether or not you can like do medium punch float into another attack, or if you can just float. And therefore there's another thing that I must ask at some point, either for him himself, if I ever encounter him again in these situations, or any high level Dhalsim player that can let me know. Can you, at that moment that's just in, hit the medium punch, float, and then hit something else? Have you lost your trip guard? Do you have air defense still? Because a lot of this, tactically, was based around the fact that if Chun-Li takes small amounts of damage, she can avoid much bigger amounts of damage later on, and tire or frustrate Dhalsim. She's better at generally dealing damage to him, aside from certain left-right mix-ups he has. And that becomes even more so when you tend to be jumping out of a lot of his normals intended to keep you out. The thing you must not do when you're practicing with the CPU is assume that because the CPU can't do something, a player cannot. Input reading or not, the way that the CPU makes these decisions is probably based on a neural network which is trained as you play, which is another good reason to have this sort of thing. If it is in any way neural network training, fighting a CPU that will never fall is the way to get the maximum amount of information out of it. One good example is that I have learned over time not to care so much if Dhalsim resets Chun-Li out of the air with that upward anti-air snipe. This isn't to say I should be spending a lot of time jumping forward, but he can definitely snipe her out when she tries to jump back from particular positions. And my reaction to that was, okay, it doesn't do a lot of damage. It leads to a reset that I'm not uncomfortable with. I'll just leave it. But I can't count on this, because just because the CPU can't do it doesn't mean that there isn't an option. I may end up facing a player who knows exactly what to do after that to punish whatever I do. But you can make certain inferences based on the spacing you're at, based on the character's options. I can say, given Dhalsim's options, as I understand them, he doesn't have a lot of things to make sure that you're going to be able to take damage after that. He has to take some risk to try to damage you, and you might be able to get out of some of the things that he would try. Whereas, you could easily conceptually see, if I were trying to jump forward against Dhalsim naturally to get in, what happens is a lot worse. So let's try that for a little bit. I'm going to try to get in on Dhalsim by jumping. Note that the speed at which he recovers from those normals is quick enough that though you've gotten out of the way of the first one, it's really a toss-up as to whether or not you could hit him before you can launch a second one, or find the right button to attack with. You can absolutely check this yourself. It doesn't require Chun-Li. You can definitely slip between his normals sometimes. And there are other times when you can't do anything. But as you can see, the more one moves forward, the more you're counting on the luck of either the anti-air being too fast, or the reset not harming you. Neither of these things necessarily happens consistently enough that you should count on it. Because there is one thing you can definitely say about the CPU that's relative to players. If the CPU can consistently stop you from doing it, chances are any high-level player also can. This also goes for our bots, obviously, because they're even less directly based on what you're doing. If you realize a bot is stopping you from doing something, it's probably rhythmic and has to do with the interactions between the characters, and should never be tried against a top-level player, because even if they've never had to do it before, unless it is one of the trickiest possible mix-ups, you're not going to get very far. So, honestly, this went from being nearly impossible when I started to I can see where the spacings for things are going to happen, and I now know approximately where to attack. I can jump over Yoga Flames. I can jump out of Yoga Gale. I can do resets that would lead to the opponent taking damage if I knew that they were going to continue attacking, because I would have charge, because I practiced having charge for EX Spinning Bird. At the beginning of this, none of this was... I would just have gotten entirely bodied if it had come up. For example, I've learned, take that every time. If you cannot figure out how to get around Dhalsim's... If you can't figure out how to get around that ball, especially if the air one, jump onto it. Fortunately, this is apparently around the optimal situation. Because if you jump onto it, the recovery behaves differently. And Dhalsim loses some of his mix-ups. If you stand there and block it, you have to deal with all of the mix-ups that they have had a lot of time to practice and long since built up for dealing with that situation. Now, it's quite likely that a lot of players have built up responses to you jumping onto it as well, but there are some things in the game that are more or less just a given. There are times when there's no way to increase their damage anymore. The situation just can't lead into a reset or a mix-up. Finding those, especially against the CPU, can save you a lot of heartache. Similarly, I've learned, after certain situations in which you do get reset out of the air by Dhalsim's attack because you jumped on his teleport rather than doing the crouch light defense, Dhalsim can hit you in ways that you absolutely can't get out of. He is plus, he has a certain move with a certain amount of active frames that you can't get around. There's nothing you could start up in time other than invincible moves. That might not be worth it. So even though it feels like a scramble of, okay, maybe I should try to hit a button, the CPU can teach you quite quickly, because of its tendency towards certain types of perfection, no, you shouldn't hit that button. You will always lose. You can also use it to try to figure out if there are variables in the situation that you can check that will make it possible. But as you can see, reversal, I'm pretty sure that no matter what I hit after that reset, Dhalsim wins. That slide will win. I'm also fairly sure that the slide itself ends up being safe, so it's not as if the high level player who knows this has any reason to not hit it. So, from just CPU practice, I've learned a lot of mobility things and a lot of small defense things. I've also learned overall how stressful this match is when you don't have certain things, and how much I could give myself in terms of credit or understanding if I were to face someone who had a lot of the standard style Dhalsim tactics down. This is good for those of us who don't manage to understand characters that well by ourselves. They tell you, play the character a little bit and see if you can learn them. But for particularly strange characters, this can be really hard. And you get used to this if you play games like Guilty Gear. You can't just go from your main of Chip to playing Venom and feel as if, oh yeah, I'm good, I know what Venom does now. And Dhalsim's defense is quite good in this game based on this now. While you can whiff punish a lot of the stuff he sticks out, you can't necessarily take any time whatsoever to approach him after he's tried to hit you. If you've blocked an attack from Dhalsim, walking forward is the quickest way to die. But interestingly, because so many of his moves are like -4, jumping out of them at certain ranges is just 100%, more or less. This sort of thing is how we create katas in the first place. By observation of situations that come up while just trying something or practicing with a particular character. The better the CPU behavior for the character, obviously, the more you can learn from it. So let's take a basic look at Fang in that same way. This may not seem like a very strong or useful CPU Fang. Possibly completely true. And as you can see, the CPU flatly cheats when it comes to charge characters, which is why we don't generally suggest doing it. If you ever wanted proof that the CPU just cheats, Fang is that proof. Watch him, he's walking forward. Don't try hiding it now, Fang. We've seen you. We just saw it. You can't trick us now. So do remember this if you choose to do it against charge characters, that yes, they don't have to have charge, they can just cheat. The game at least tries to make it look like that, but occasionally I guess they miss some of the coding that says, yeah, you don't have enough time to charge that. As you can see, beating up on this is trivial. It's partially because he's so cheating that it's trivial. You can't walk forward into Sotosha Fang, that's not how that works. Can't walk forward into that either. Or at least if you can, someone really needs to explain to me how this option select works. No, that was also not possible. Wait, no, that one was. Never mind. Sorry, Fang, I got distracted in all your other cheating. So, I brought him up and show him just as a general demonstration. You can't count on this for every character. And obviously you should not do this sort of thing without some understanding of the game beforehand. To know what is and is not possible. to understand when the CPU is absolutely reading your inputs and cheating, having a certain reaction because it knows that you hit a certain button. But you can manipulate this information as well if you understand frame data well enough. So let's go demonstrate that a little bit. The Rashid kata is based almost entirely on this. The Korean kata, to an extent, that one's a little bit more work to explain in detail. We'll have an in-depth up for that at some point for people who have moved beyond just trying to do what it says or have had trouble doing what it says because of the complexity of the kata. But let's look at input reading and the cheapness that comes with that. Not you. Using Cammy's ability. Any character with sufficiently quick inputs and good buttons for stopping you from doing things can take advantage of the fact that your button literally takes a frame longer than theirs does, and theirs will win. The CPU can therefore go, okay, my 5-frame button beats your 7-frame button. I have just seen you press the 7-frame button. I will hit my 5-frame button 1 frame later, and I will win. Cammy is notorious for this in CPU mode. And the fact that she has that back medium punch, which is 4 frames, means that a lot of things you want to hit in neutral just don't work. But she also teaches you something else. In order to frame trap, the CPU must go to its next button anyway. This is how the kata works for Karin, and how certain things work for Rashid. In Rashid's case, is because most of the buttons you need him to hit are slow. But in Karin's case, it is because she is doing things that are effectively frame traps and can't delay even 1 frame, or you would get an opening that would not otherwise exist. But, there you go. What I practice on Cammy is wake up, instant jump, head stomp. However, because of the input reading, there's a trick to it. Unless I do that input at literally the last possible frame, if I'm holding up before it, Cammy can counter it. In fact, I believe she can counter it 100% of the time. The only thing I think that delays her is whether or not I'm able to turn it into air legs, which is usually not even relevant. So, Cammy gets a knockdown and gets close, and my check as to whether or not I did that wake up well enough is whether or not Cammy does cannon spike on my wake up. If she does, it indicates that I held up until a particular moment where the game believes I was going to jump and used its anti-air instantly. I had to be holding it like 3 frames before because of the frame data interaction. The CPU needs to know that I'm going to jump approximately 3 frames before I actually do it, even considering the fact that there is pre-jump frames. But I can assure you, at least since Season 2, maybe it's changed now, that if I'm holding up with the hope or expectation of doing that wake up and Cammy is next to me, I will get hit out of that with her cannon spike at least 90% of the time. This does not always happen if she's not right in front of me. It also does not happen if she goes for that mix-up, but it really doesn't matter in that case. So it might be a little hard for me to show you now because I'm actually really conditioned to do it correctly. But you can test it out for yourself. It's not the easiest of wake-ups to do, but assuming that Cammy is right in your face, you will find that she reads your inputs and manages the punish a phenomenally stupid amount of time. She doesn't even always have to do that. She can just, as just noted, do the bat medium punch. This is actually good training in certain ways against players as well. Not because most players are people who read your stick movements or have a good guess on you pad-wise. But just as a general thing for getting yourself to do things later into actions and therefore let go of the feeling of doing them. So, you can absolutely manipulate CPU Cammy based on when you hit up forward on your own wake up. If she's not standing within range to be hit by the head stomp in the first place, she doesn't even react. So if you do it perfectly and she's just not there, well, that's information as well. She also obviously now can air throw you in that position, which is even more ridiculous. And whether or not she lands it, based on my observation, is mostly about the same sort of thing. Did you do your wake up correctly? Did you have the correct timing for getting in or out of this? Because a lot of whether or not you succeed against Cammy doing this has to do with how perfect your timing was at doing it and how little you telegraphed it before you actually did it. Therefore, she's my training partner for this particular thing. And that took me probably like 4 sessions to get to the point where it wasn't stupid. Bonus to the fact that if you can do it just right, you can fake her into doing the cannon spike for no reason. And there are similar things with other characters with fast buttons that you can use to measure your reactions to things and practice those reactions. If you think you'd have trouble coming up with these yourself, we'll probably start sharing them, even if they are character specific, such as this, but probably more so in these streams than on our website directly. Primarily because it's better to have a couple people test it with different characters or just test it with their own timings and see if something's different about it. Another really good candidate for this, CPU-wise, is Zangief. But this is a theoretical information piece. I know that it can be done because of how Zangief's frame data is and how his ranges are. But I'm demonstrating how to work this sort of thing out because I've never done it with Zangief before. I don't technically know what I should be doing here. So, just as a demonstration, let's look through how this can go. Well, the first thing that I would guess is that he can tell whether or not to go for SPD or not, based on if you were trying to backdash at the time you were moving. You were in range, you got into a reset, and you either chose to backdash out of the reset or didn't. If you blocked, he'll usually be able to SPD you, right? Or stuff like that. Although that's more of a combo. Bat jump also works. So if you have experience with this character, you can just fight him normally and wait for resets to happen and train yourself to backdash out of them. Because it's more likely that the Zangief player knows whether or not they can do it after your reset than you. This gives a heavy advantage to a player that knows that you can do this reset. There's one. I should have expected jumping there. I should have expected something else there too. That was a reset there also. And presumably, the CPU knows that it wasn't at advantage enough to hit any buttons. This sort of thing takes a while to learn as a total thing, but you can still get stuff out of it, even while trying. That, for example, is basically the same thing. This move is +2 on block. This means that if the timing for my follow-up crouch medium kick or something is perfect, Zangief cannot in fact throw me. But you'll notice that as soon as I'm slightly off timing-wise, not only do I get SPD'd, I get reversal SPD'd. This means that the CPU had the capacity to wait exactly 1 frame, recognize that by that exact 1 or 2 frames, I was too slow to do it properly. Or that its SPD wouldn't reach, whichever. And that it shouldn't hit the button. Well, it shouldn't do the move. So if your thought is, okay, I know that this will or will not work based on the frame data, based on the gap in this, you can practice it against a CPU character who tends to punish you for being even a slightly bit off. That was even more so, because I actually hit with that one, so I should have been even more plus. But I mistimed the medium kick based on that, and got SPD'd again. Similarly, we can learn that Zangief doesn't necessarily do that every time, but probably often enough that you could basically learn from it. Similarly, he's reading those inputs and knowing that he will land the SPD because I have hit a 7-frame move in neutral. It's not because he just tends to SPD randomly at that space. He's usually actually trying to defend. But the CPU is watching, did you hit this correctly? Similarly, when it goes for frame traps, even really slow or weird ones based on range, that it would not otherwise, you would not otherwise see in games because no one would actually try those. Different things will happen. The reason I know at least some of this for Zangief is because while against Cammy I practice instant wake up head stomp, against Zangief I practice wake up instant air legs, which is frustratingly harder. But whenever you get it wrong, Zangief has a particular reaction, and whenever you get it right, he has a different one. Similarly, I've learned how air resets relative to that move work based on this as well. And unlike Cammy, where I have trained that over and over because being able to wake up instant head stomp is really useful in a lot of matchups, wake up instant air legs is a lot less useful. He's also a good character for me to practice that particular thing against. And I was looking for one. In fact, many characters can benefit from this, and it might even be another kata to deal with. Of all the characters in this game who have air reset style interactions, very few of them have as much consistency and difference in range at the same time. Consistent in that they tend to cause the air reset, but have different ranges at which they cause it, compared to Zangief. Laura is also decent at it, but she has a lot more options in terms of moving space-wise, and will tend to be more stressful in the mid-range. Whereas Zangief, you can be fairly sure where he's going to be, and you're just trying to avoid a particular thing. If you spend a lot of time in the air against Zangief and he doesn't happen to hit you with certain things, you can easily get air reset often enough to practice your own reactions to it. Similarly, you get this sort of setup happening a lot, where you haven't been reset but you've been hit by Lariat, and because of how the CPU plays relative to this, it almost always advances after landing the Lariat. So you can use it to check yourself and practice all sorts of little air reset things. It's not clear why CPU Zangief has less reactions. Maybe it's because he has less tools and they decided, let's make him Zangief, let's make him advance more. But you can see the number of different little things you could get out of this just by wanting to understand your own air reset stuff. Your own air-to-air stuff. He's a decent way to do this if you don't have Alex Bot. The difficulty being that Alex Bot is for when you are chasing someone and are unfamiliar with their spacing because of that. Zangief's spacing tends to be a lot more, again, consistent. The range, not so much. But in Alex's case, if you're fighting the bot properly, you neither get consistency nor range, so you get to learn more. Still, if you want to start off with this and you don't have Alex bot around, Zangief can do a good job of it for you. For example, I've just learned that that does not work. Using this sort of thing to practice little bits of your game that not necessarily apply to the character you're facing only can help you quite a lot. So it's good to explore what each character does when you play against them normally, through that lens of things you might be able to learn as yourself. A good example is that both of those times I basically did jump medium kick on his jump. And both times I realized, I probably don't have time to hit anything. He tacked to the throw the first time. But the window to tack throws is quite large. It doesn't imply that he was hitting throw at the same time. So I went for Hake to see, do I actually have less time than I think? Because if I was not very plus there, the Hake would probably gotten SPD'd, because we know that he can and read Hake inputs and beat them with a fast move. Yet he blocked it. So from now on, I'm generally going to be watching when I happen to clip him in the air with this, usually as a mistake of trying to do instant air legs on wake up and failing. At what point does hitting a Hake become a bad idea? At what point do I get SPD'd or supered or something? And even then, you might need to do a lot more work as well. Because every time you hit someone in the air, whether or not you are at advantage, whether or not you are plus on the reset, the landing, is based on how far away you were and the speed at which you hit the button. So, while the Dhalsim one does not apply to all characters, I can definitely suggest that if you want to feel out your own air resets and certain wake-ups, there is still something you can gain from just fighting CPU Zangief. It helps that he's also tall and you can learn things about your instant jump style attacks. You can learn when not to go for things because your opponent might not have put themselves in range during that air reset. can learn that you failed execution on wake-ups because you didn't hit the up at all. Let's see. Looks like at all. And got supered as a result. It's a very binary sort of back and forth thing. You fail and Zangief punishes you basically immediately. I wouldn't say he does it 100% of the time, but it's consistent enough that you could gain data and learn from it. Unambiguously. And for such a big guy, he has enough evasive hitboxes that you can learn things about where your moves hit and where they don't hit by interacting with him. Unlike Abigail, who is literally a truck and you can't miss him. You can learn about your own character's jump arc and their options in certain spaces based on that jump arc. Certain frame traps also become more visible. And since he tends to have such a good setup on Wake Up, even the CPU is intended to use most of those. And you get to learn about your Wake Up timings. Are they good? Are they too fast? Are they too slow? Did you spend insufficient time looking at what your opponent could do? All of these little things matter. Not to mention all the little air throw practice nonsense you can get up to with certain characters. So, when you want to practice execution, when you want to practice timing, and most importantly, one of the key things of this game, when you want to practice recognizing situations correctly and responding to those situations based on what you recognized, give the CPU a chance. Spend some time figuring out which character is good for the thing you want to know, but you'll also build up a fair idea of what the characters are good for and what they spend their time pressing on in you. And just a few notes of that will let you decide later when you need another one to practice something different. Alright, I saw this one use this thing. Maybe this will help with the training I want to do now. Because there are few things more frustrating than trying to go online to find someone to help you practice something and being outright unable to do it because there's just no one online playing that character right now, or the people who are don't understand, you can't communicate with them easily, or they're just not interested in teaching you that thing and are more interested in beating you up. This game does not have the greatest of tutorials, and it definitely does not, even now, have single-player content that will prepare you for head-to-head content without quite a lot of coaching or understanding. And that is what we are here to try to do. We're trying to give you that little extra push over the hump of how do I convert my willingness to play against the CPU for a while, to play solo for a while, into something I can use to get better if I ever want to play against friends or just go to a tournament to have some fun. It might even help you feel inspired to go to tournaments just to try out things that you have managed against this. And trust me, the FGC is, at worst, they're usually quiet. At least at tournaments. If you have social anxiety, yes, it might be stressful to think that this opponent is not thinking highly of you, but nearly no one is outright rude in any of my experiences, so they'll let you test your thing, they'll beat you up terribly for doing it. It could be a complete bust. They might not want to play you more. But the people at tournaments, especially big ones, tend to have a lot of time. They're okay with this. They'll give you your first to 3 to test your stuff. And you can make your notes and decide that was fun or not fun. I'm going to go home and look for a different way to train this or think about this. And you can go back to having your single player fun. Knowing that if you ever chose to pursue it seriously, or just felt like having multiplayer fun, that you wouldn't have to feel as if, oh, I can never be good, I can't progress, or any of those things. These spaces do give you at least some tools for this, if you understand what to look for. So, try it out. Give the Zangief Sipushu a shot. If you play Vega or Chun-Li or Juri, go poke at Dhalsim. Even the hard version of the arcade doesn't do quite a good enough job at the moment. And it doesn't learn fast enough unless you give it infinite health. So it depends on how you perceive success or victory. If you're the sort of person that has to actually win visibly, you might want to try to find a different way. But for the rest of you, this will probably be fine. As for me, I have some Zangief to dodge, and some Dhalsim to outmaneuver. So, this has been Rillian, 42_MK. Join us next week for Mishmashing Battle Lounge content on Monday, Street Fighter V Casuals. Casuals in the sense that it's beginners just learning new stuff. However, if you are much higher level or pro and have something to demonstrate, feel free to join our lounge, which will be up at around 7 PM Eastern Time and run for about 2 hours. Tuesday is our Guilty Gear Tuesday Train lobby. Similar content, loser stays on, starting at 7 Eastern for about 3 hours. And next week, Wednesday, probably more Sandbag Casuals. Finally circling around to Kame House content on Thursday, and probably more of this sort of thing next Friday. Although, by then I will have looked at the Cody showcase and might have some stuff to show off somewhere. Therefore, with that, I hope your training goes well going into your weekend. And don't give up. It'll always come, even if it doesn't all come at once. Good night, everyone.